Now, a little background about David Dornbos, our speaker today. He has been a faculty member at the Calvin College Biology Department, teaching courses and mentoring graduate students since 2004. He has also worked in crop genetics and agronomy in the agricultural industry in roles such as the global head of seed production field agronomist. He is a member of the Iowa State University graduate faculty, where he earned a PhD in crop production. He also holds an MS degree from Ohio State University and finally a BS in biology from Calvin University. He has also authored a book called Your Steak, S-T-E-A-K, in the World. And this course is themed on what was in his book. So today is session 3 of our food system and its impact. David Dornbos will introduce agroecology, which he describes as ecological principles applied to the management of food systems and agriculture as a better alternative to our present agricultural practices. So with that, I'll turn the microphone over to David Dornbos after he takes a little walk.
And thank you, Tom. It's good to see everybody again here today. I'm walking and talking a little better than I was last week. So last week we talked about our current food production system. The prior week we had talked about the impact of the food we consume on human health. So what we want to do today is talk about the impact of industrialized monocultures on our environmental health, and then introduce the idea of agroecology as an alternative, a more sustainable approach, which I think is kind of explicitly better positioned to provide the kinds of foods that we would consume if we were participating in something like a DASH dietary pattern. So a diet rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, with even some meat and some dairy. So that's where we're going. We're going to set up hopefully this week for next week, which is going to be getting into then the costs as well as the ethics that we might consider thinking about as vehicles to change our food system. So if you imagine kind of where I left you off last week, thinking about how our current food production system works, and then you start thinking about what an agroecological system might look like, you realize there's huge space between those two. And so the question is, how do you convince a general public that can go to a grocery store today and get kind of in all of the color, any of the food that they would want for actually not very much money compared to what normal incomes are in places like the United States? How do you convince them to support a very different system? So that's kind of what the challenge, the hope for next week is. So the outline is picking up where the outline left off last time, environmental impacts of crop production. How many of you have heard of sustainable agriculture? Most everybody. So I think we need to talk a little bit about that, what that means, as a way then of segueing into what ecological impacts of meat production are on greenhouse gas emissions, as well as overall sustainability kind of anyway, or maybe in spite of our attempts to make a sustainable agricultural system. So it's to kind of say, okay, what I'd like to say is sustainable ag is a good thing, and I certainly would want to promote it. There is a problem with the paradigm of the system in which sustainable ag is focused. And that's what I want to distinguish here in this idea of agroecology as a possible alternative. And then we'll dig into that. Okay. Couple of just bottom line impacts of our food production system on ecological health or environmental health. These come from a guy by the name of Peter Raven, who has written a whole bunch of textbooks. This is taken from an article written in Science magazine a few years ago. And he reported then in the early 2000s that we were applying something on the order of 3 million metric tons of active ingredient of pesticides to our agricultural lands per year. So 3 million metric tons of active ingredient. That's not just the weight of the pesticide, that's specifically the active ingredient. So that's a lot of pesticide. And in pesticides, we're talking about chemicals that kill weeds. Herbicides, we're talking about chemicals that kill insects. Insecticides, we're talking about pesticides that kill fungi or fungal pathogens, so fungicides. He points out that more nitrogen is fixed with fossil fuel using the Haber-Bosch process, which if you read Alchemy and Air, you'll understand a bit more about how that process works. So we're making more nitrogen fertilizer than all natural sources of biological nitrogen fixation combined. So that's kind of gives us sense when we fertilize agricultural fields, when we fertilize golf courses, when we fertilize lawns, that is biologically available, biologically active nitrogen that plants can take up and will promote growth. And we're applying globally now more fertilizer from nitrogen than all natural processes combined. So we've got nitrogen fixing plants like the legumes. So they will convert nitrogen gas in the air into the nitrogen that we would find in amino acids of proteins or in nucleotides of our DNA. They do that. So we're saying if we add up all of what bacteria do naturally, there's more nitrogen in the globe from fossil fuel sources. So that is a good thing and a bad thing. So imagine if we double the amount or more than double the amount of biologically active nitrogen in the Earth's biosphere, what are the impacts of that? Yes.
What percentage of fossil fuel is being used to do that?
Not sure I can tell you, but I'll tell you, we'll come at that from another perspective with the slide a little bit later on. We'll talk about in terms of greenhouse gas emissions from the burning of fossil fuels to do that. I've got that number for you a little later on, but I want to say it's around the lines of like 8% of the total fossil fuel. 35% of topsoil, the O and the A horizons, which plants use to derive most of their nutrition in about half of their water, have already eroded, have already moved from agricultural fields into aquatic systems. So when mostly in this part of the world, when it rains, in the western part of the world, when the wind blows, topsoil, these small particles of soil are what erodes. And so what we're doing is we're taking off the top layers of soil. So this is saying is a third of the topsoil that's been there for some centuries has already eroded. 1/3 of global forests have been cut the last 50 years. That's a little bit weird. That's kind of a weird number in a sense, because in the United States, this is global forest. In the United States, we have afforested. We've increased forest cover tremendously. But globally, if you look at what's happening in Southeast Asia with palm plantations, for example, and if you think about Latin America, Brazil, we are continuing to, at a global level, deforest much faster than we are afforesting, even though in the North America and United States, we've afforested. Probably a number that I'm going to settle on a little bit here, we'll think a little bit more about is extinction rate. The rate that species are becoming extinct is 100 to 1,000 times the geologic baseline. So that species would become extinct is not surprising. It's not unusual. It's not unexpected. Species normally become extinct. What's different is the rate of extinction. So when we say at 100 to 1,000 times, that's 2 to 3 orders of magnitude faster than geologically you might expect extinction events to happen. So we should think about maybe what's driving that. And bottom line is, of course, agriculture, our food production system's got its fingerprints all over this. So monocultures are planted on 880 million acres, or 39% of the United States terrestrial land space. We talked about that last week. So we talked about the 880 million acres. I'm not sure I positioned it as this is like 39 or over a third of land area in the United States is corn, soybean, wheat, cotton, alfalfa. So what are the implications of that? That's a lot of corn. That's a lot of cornfields.
I mean, you're depleting the soil, using the same crop over and over again.
So when you grow corn following corn in the same field, or even to a degree corn soybean rotation, you're depleting the soils that are there. You're probably tilling, which is driving the erosion. If you kind of go back to that slide, imagine we're applying pesticides there, because if you've got corn in large areas, you get insects that are specialized for corn, e.g. the European corn borer, the corn rootworm. The name of the crop is actually in the name of the insect, at least the common name of the insect. So these are insects that are problems when you have big areas of the same kind of plant. If you were to have intermixed plants, they're not a problem, because they can't find enough of corn to be able to really become the pest. Yes.
Well, I think you probably said it. What I was worried about is one uncontrolled disease is going to wipe out a full crop.
Correct. So if you have one uncontrolled disease or insect, you could wipe out the entire crop. So how do we prevent that from happening? I mean, how have you done it in your grass lawns? Because a grass lawn is a monoculture. What did you do? You apply pesticides. So you apply fungicides, you apply insecticides, you're looking for leaves that are turning brown in a certain way, you're looking for the fingerprints of a particular kind of disease, and then you want to apply a pesticide that would kill that disease. You're also probably going to need to apply nitrogen fertilizer on a grass lawn, because I know at home, if I don't apply nitrogen on my grass lawn, white clover will take over. Well, white clover is a legume, a lot like soybean. If I apply nitrogen fertilizer, the advantage of nitrogen fixation goes away and white clover cannot compete. So we're doing the same thing there as what is happening in a cornfield. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about that 39%.
Yes.
Is that only lands that are capable of growing crops, or is that total land mass of the world?
That is the land that is currently in monoculture, or is over years, it stays pretty stable. These are the fields, the land area that is capable of crop production in the United States. So it is the area of corn, soybeans, wheat. If you look at how many acres are in those crops and you look at the total land area in the United States and you divide, that's the number you get.
Okay. Whether they're actually planted in the crops.
No, these are actually planted.
Okay,
It's not the potential area. Although I will say most potential crop growing area in the United States is planted in crops.
okay.
Most of the area in the United States that's not planted in crops is not suitable for crop production. So think mountains of Colorado, the high plains of Colorado where it's too dry and there's not water available to irrigate with. So pretty much most every place that you can grow crops in, we are growing crops.
Okay, thank you.
Even in Michigan, we still see the tendency of woodlots get chopped down here and there as people are in a farmer, if they're not actively like collecting maple sap out of a woodlot, farmers see a woodlot as land area where they could be growing corn or soybean and they'll tend to chop them down. Oh, I wanted to go back. If we think about other implications, how about this one right here? Is this 100 to 1,000 times the geologic baseline, the extinction rate affected by that? So a monoculture, to Javier's point, is a monoculture has by definition very little biodiversity in it. If you think about it, a farmer is paid for the corn grain that they produce. So they're going to do anything and everything that they can to produce more corn grain. Any other kind of plant growing in that field is a competitor. It's going to take some of the nitrogen fertilizer that they pay good money to spread out there. And if milkweeds, for example, get some of that nitrogen fertilizer or water or light, kind of all the major resources that plants need to grow, that's a competitor. That means they're getting less corn. So a farmer, to keep milkweeds out of that field, does what? They're going to apply a pesticide and they're going to kill those milkweeds. Now think about it from the perspective of another kind of biodiversity, the monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly needs to traverse across fields where there would be in the spring some milkweeds growing to be able to move from Mexico to the northern states of the United States, for example, in Canada, where they then end their migration, they turn around and they come back a couple generations later. If there's no food out in those cornfields for a monarch butterfly to eat, kind of by definition, the farmer has gone out of the way to take out all the fence rows that would have milkweeds in them, because a farmer doesn't get paid for a fence row. A farmer doesn't get paid for a woodlot. A farmer doesn't get paid for monarch butterflies. So it's simply to stay alive, if you will, as a farmer, to stay economically competitive, they have to be able to control these landscapes. And so we are talking, 40% of the US. And you can go to Argentina and Brazil and those kinds of places where the crop growing areas and those ratios are similar. So I kind of like this article. This was published.
Just a quick one.
Yeah, sure.
So what percentage is then left, which is not monoculture and not other land?
Well, it's 61% would be the number, but of course,
For agriculture.
yeah, not much.
Okay.
It's maybe a couple percent.
Okay.
In fact, I think we talked about it last week. Much of what we have used for agricultural land in places surrounding Chicago, Detroit, Grand Rapids, even Holland, as you get urban crawl, we are losing agricultural space to urbanization. We build houses on it and build, stores and that sort of thing, which are good things, right? I understand we don't have enough housing for people now. But if you're pushing it into agricultural fields, imagine that farmer is either going to stop farming or they're going to farm other areas. There just really are no significant other landscape areas available for farmers to farm that, would be economically feasible to actually produce crops on. You can't grow a garden everywhere. We pick our spots carefully. So this is a fairly important little article. It was written in Scientific American by a guy named Foley. And what he looked at are what he called global boundaries. And this was not an article written about agriculture at all, but I looked at one of his graphics and read the article several times because it's disturbing to me to see this. And I looked at this and I realized, okay, what did he pick out as boundaries? So it's things like climate change, novel entities, don't know what that means. Ozone depletion is probably something you've heard a little bit about. Atmospheric aerosol loading, how many aerosols we're putting up into the atmosphere, ocean acidification, biochemical flows focused on nitrogen and phosphorus, two leading fertilizers that we use. He talked about freshwater use, land system. What he did is he looked at people that had published results in all kind of these areas, and he asked the question of, in which of these boundaries do we need to be concerned? And so he did kind of the green light, yellow light, red light thing. You know, it's kind of like if you're driving along and you're coming up to an intersection, if it's a green light, go for it. Everything's okay. Yellow light is like, start tapping on the brake. Maybe we gotta stop. Maybe you hit the accelerator because the yellow light shows up late and you're just going to kind of skate through before it turns red. But if the light's red, you got to stop. Then you got to hit the brakes. And so he was asking kind of from the perspective of these boundaries, where are we good in the yellow? Where should we have a concern? I'm sorry, where are we good in the green? Where are we yellow? Should we have a concern? And where are we red? Red being we've exceeded the boundary of the Earth's capacity to handle it, at which point you could be at some sort of a tipping point, like things could get really not good very fast. So that's what he did. When I looked at these boundaries in the ones that turned out to be quite yellow and red, I'm thinking genetic diversity, monocultures. Where do we have the least amount of genetic diversity? Agriculture, 39% of the land area. There are like 3 inbred lines that all corn hybrids are pretty much derived from. Functional biodiversity. Okay, that's a question mark, but functional diversity would be like bluebirds eat insects. So bluebirds are cute and they sing pretty and but they're functionally important if you want to control insects without using pesticides, for example. So that's an example of functional diversity. Biochemical flows. Where do we use most of our nitrogen and phosphorus? Agriculture, 39% of the land surface area. And then land system change. Well, what system has changed most land? Agriculture. It's like 40% or more of total land area, from forest and prairie to corn and soybeans. And then where did it go? Climate change is yellow. He actually does not have that even really close to the red. So let's call it light yellow. Well, what is the agricultural footprint on global greenhouse gases? Turns out about 30% of greenhouse gases are from ag, which is by far the number one producer of greenhouse gases. So I'm looking at this article by Foley and going like, agriculture's got its fingerprints all over this chart. And it's industrialized agriculture. It's the use of industrialized monocultures that are driving these boundaries that we probably should be concerned about. This is another one. This comes from World Watch Institute. It's a little bit older, but it kind of makes an important point. And it made an important point to me about 10 years ago, which notably that was like 10 years after I had left agriculture. I'll note that when you take courses in agronomy at Ohio State, Iowa State, probably wherever you go, you talk about agricultural fields. You talk about agricultural systems. You might talk about ecological effects in those systems, but never, ever in my master or PhD or working as an ag professional for 15 years with lots of farmers, did we ever talk about an agricultural field as an ecosystem? Never. We talk about production fields. We talk about production capacity. We don't think in ag of farm fields as being ecosystems. So why is that important? It's important for this reason. Here's the point that I want to make, is this report card. The report card for World Watch Institute. Look at the top columns. Agro on the left, coastal, so think coral reefs, forest, freshwater, and grasslands. Those are all names of kind of big ecosystems. We'll call them biomes. And I'm seeing here in 2001 is when this was published. I'm seeing agro next to coastal ecosystems and forest ecosystems. And I was like going, they can't put agro there. It's not the same thing. But then I'm going like, but wait a minute. Agricultural fields are kind of like ecosystems. They function a lot like ecosystems. I guess why can't they put them there? So I was like a little ticked off at the authors. Well, here they point out, if you look at the green, agro systems yield well now. They're green. So the current condition is good. Yeah, we produce lots of food. And that's something that our ag systems do. We produce a lot of food with very little labor. But the production practice is undermining future productivity. Why do I say that? It's because if you look at, okay, food and fiber production is green, water quality, the quality of water in an agro ecosystem or in a production field is brown, poor. Water quantity is fair. Biodiversity is poor, of course, because they're monocultures. So, of course, biodiversity is poor. And then carbon storage capacity is orange, kind of fair. Well, the more we till, the more we lose organic matter. So when you lose organic matter to mineralization, that's essentially we're losing our carbon storage. We're using our carbon storage, our stored carbon faster than it's being replenished. And so that kind of said, okay, wow, yeah. So we're definitely farming in a way that is undermining our future capacity to produce food. And I'm going, does that make sense? And I think it does. And the reason I think it makes sense is because irrigation systems are popping up in southwestern Michigan, southeast of Grand Rapids, where generally farmers never needed irrigation systems before. Why do they need irrigation systems there? It's because the crops get dry in the summer. Why do the crops get dry in the summer now and they didn't 10 or 15 years ago? Partly they're yielding more, but that doesn't make up for all of it. It's not, well, it could be a little bit of warming. Warmer air requires plants to be able to access more water to grow. Water table is, no, they're well above the water table. That's down deeper. Oh, they could be. We're preventing water from going to the water table for sure. Erosion. Where does most of that water get stored? It's in the A and the O horizons of those top layers of soil, which I said were 35% eroded. So here's kind of a couple of little details about that will start to make sense. If you want to grow 200 bushels of corn in an acre, you need 26 linear inches of water in a growing season. So that's like, imagine water up to just slightly above my knees. A pool of water that deep over every square inch of an agricultural field. That's how much water. You ever wonder why it gets really humid around here in June and July and August? Well, Lake Michigan is out there, but even in Grand Rapids, we don't get that effect quite so much. It's all of the water coming through the plant leaves. So plant leaves are using a quarter of an inch of water a day, a quarter inch of linear water a day. So we do live in a humid climate, and it does rain here during the growing season. On average, during the 3 months that our crops are growing, 18 to 19 inches of linear water. There's a deficit. The crop needs during May, June, July, and August, 26 inches. It gets 18 to 19 in rainfall. Where is it going to get that other 7 or 8 inches from? the water that's stored in soils from the snow that melted the previous winter. If we've got less soil to store that water, you got to make up that difference somewhere. And so that's why they're putting irrigation systems in, is because their topsoil is eroded. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist. I mean, you can go out in the spring before they've actually planted in their fields, and you look at the tops of the hills. They tend to be reddish in color, which means the organic matter, those top A, O, A, and actually a lot of the B horizon is no longer there. It's eroded down into the valleys. The little valleys in a field look darker in color. That's where the organic matter is going. If it continues to erode, it will flow into the creeks and then later on rivers and streams. That was an important thing for me, is to figure out or to understand that, wait, production fields are ecosystems. And so I need to start thinking of them as ecosystems. One thing you're taught in biology classes is no ecosystem exists solo. Ecosystems of one type interact with bordering ecosystems of other types. So water that falls on a terrestrial, like a forest, will matriculate down through the soil to the water table, which keeps then the level of water in the local marshes and swamps at a certain level, so that it can be a marsh or a swamp. What that kind of means is we have to also look at coastal, forest, freshwater, and grassland ecosystems, think about how they are interacting with agroecosystems. So here's one of those little things that I like to put in your head. Whatever you put on land will end up in the water. Whatever you put on land will eventually end up in the water. So if I spray pesticides, some of that pesticide gets soaked up into the plant, but most of it sits dry on the plant, and then it rains. What happens to that pesticide? It washes off it dissolves in the rainwater, which goes where? Eventually into the local stream, into the river, like Michigan here. Whatever I do on land is, so when I apply 200 pounds of actual nitrogen to a crop field, and I know that the crop is getting on average 20% of that, where does the other 80% of the nitrogen go? It's going to either go into the atmosphere. Some of it does vaporize, if you will, but most of it goes down into the soil profile and then goes sideways or gets washed off and ends up in a creek or a pond, where it's going to do what? What does nitrogen, we'll get you in a sec. What does nitrogen do for a plant? You spread nitrogen on your grass, your lawn grass. What does it do? Turns it green, makes the grass grow faster. What do you suppose nitrogen in water does? Algae. It makes aquatic plants grow better. Algae as well as any other kind of aquatic plant.
What if you get your nitrogen from a cover crop like alfalfa?
Yes.
And how does economically and how does that affect that whole picture?
Yeah. So that's you're getting into a sustainable ag technique. Can I hold the question? Okay, we'll hold the question, because we're gonna switch to sustainable ag here real quick, and then that will come up early on. So kind of when we put lots of nitrogen on our farm fields, or when we till, imagine those nutrients, those pesticides are going to end up in coastal reefs. They're going to end up maybe in forests. More commonly, they're going to end up in fresh water. So it shouldn't be a surprise that freshwater quality is poor, biodiversity is poor, because what we're doing on land is ending up in those ecosystems, and it's changing the function of those ecosystems as well. So the concern isn't exactly what's happening in the production field. It is, but the concern is greater. What is the production field? How are they impacting the ecosystems with which they adjoin? So Grand River and Grand Haven, when Grand River is in flood stage, what's in the water? What's in the Grand River water that's flowing out into Lake Michigan? What's making that water brown? It's not, it could be a little bit of sewage. You can't see that though, because you're talking about Salmonella, E. coli, and they would take a microscope. There's pesticides there. What's making the water chocolate milk colored? It's the soil particles. So when it rains really hard on land, especially in the spring before you've got plants growing, notice the color of the water that's streaming off a production field. What color is it in your mind? You can see it. It's brown. And so that water just carrying its sediment load, that's the topsoil water. That's the topsoil eroding off the top of the soil surface. And here's where that's what it looks like coming into Lake Michigan. Now, to some of those other things that you were saying, I'll note that soil particles are negatively charged. And if you think about some of you who have maybe some chemistry in your background, calcium, is it an anion or a cation? It's a cation. If we talk about potassium, cation or an anion, it's got a positive charge. It's a cation. Magnesium, nickel, copper, zinc, all of the nutrients that we use in plants, there are 13 essential elements. All of them are cations with one exception, nitrate, a form of nitrogen. So cations, the fertilizer that we put on land, it turns out I'll note that most of our pesticides are cationic as well. Soil particles are negatively charged. What is stuck to the soil particles? So yeah, it's the soil that you see, but it's the pesticides in the nutrients that are tied to the soil particles in that water that are also going into Lake Michigan. So we're carrying nutrients that we meant for our crops and pesticides that we meant to kill bugs and fungi in our crops. They are tied to those soil particles getting carried with soil particles during rainfall events. So it's more than, it's an example of kind of how an agroecosystem is affecting other ecosystems. So what should the water look like? That's the Tequanimon Falls. I'll bet you some of you have been there. They're really cool. That's what the Grand River should look like year round. So it's not just clear per se, it's kind of like root beer colored. The root beer color is the water that's in the Tequanimon Falls sat in swamps for a while and steeped in the leaves. And so that's the kind of the leaves as they decompose will leave some tannic acid. That's where that root beer color is coming from. The water itself is otherwise clear. That's what the lake, that's what the Grand River should look like. Two main causes of extinction are habitat loss and invasive species. So I want to come back on this one because when we get into agroecology, biodiversity is going to turn out to be really important. Specifically, what I'm going to call functional biodiversity is really, really important. So kind of as we move from year 1000 to year 2050 or something, world population, human population goes up, our ability to farm goes up to feed those people. So we're not farming for fun, we're farming to feed people. So we got to leave the people, the global population, they need to stay in this kind of equation in your mind. What's happening to species biodiversity though? Species remaining is it's going down roughly at a slightly less rate than human is going up. So what's driving species extinction? Well, two factors. Generally, it's assumed there's an acronym, HIPPO, is kind of what gets used, but habitat loss turns out to be a key driver. So what is the number one cause of habitat loss? Agriculture. We got these monoculture fields. So we got to flip to sustainable ag so we can get back to his question. So I do like the idea of sustainable ag. You've heard about it, and it is doing good things. In the first slide, we'll start to hedge. I'm going to start to hedge with you on that a little bit. So while I am a fan of sustainable agriculture, which started back in the 1960s, so sustainable ag is not a new thing, but it's still actively being implemented. And some farmers engage in sustainable ag extensively, and other farmers hardly at all. It's a bit of kind of thing. If you can do, most farmers do care deeply about their land. I do not want to throw farmers under the bus. So most farmers, if you talk to them, they want to leave their land in better position than when they got it. They want to leave it to their kids better than they got it. So, and they are well-intentioned, but a farmer can only do what he can do or she can do, right? And they've got to have the financial resources to be able to do some of these things. Turns out none of these things really come free, and sometimes there's government assistance. A lot of times there's not. So economically, can they make it work? So those are maybe some of the ideas behind it. But the idea of sustainable ag is, first of all, we want to use cultural methods to control pests, if at all possible. The second line is maybe we want to use biological controls. The reason biological after cultural, because generally cultural is cheaper than biological. Third line is if we need to, we need to do tillage. Tillage is kind of third because tillage is a problem, right? If every time you till, you're going to promote soil erosion. So yes, I want to till to kill my weeds, but I don't want to till because if I do, I'm going to cause erosion. So no-till farmers are reliant on pesticides. They're preserving soil, a great thing, but they have to control weeds than using pesticides. And then the idea of last resort, if you have to make, if it makes economic sense, after you've done everything up here that you can, let's use pesticides. The reality is farmers don't always look at it that way. Typically what it was in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even 70s and 80s, and even to a degree today is see a bug, spray a bug. See a disease, spray a disease. And what extension agencies, Michigan State Extension is trying to do is say, farmer, go out there and determine how many bugs there are. If there are a few and they're not going to cause you economic damage, don't spray. You'll actually make more money by not spraying. And so they're trying to understand economic thresholds to spray, accounting for the disease or damage caused by the pest, which it can be surprising. Soybeans during vegetative growth can be defoliated 50% with no yield loss. Soybeans, even during the time when they're filling pods, you can have insects eat 30% of the leaf area and there will be no yield loss. So it's kind of, if you have 10%, 20% yield loss or a leaf loss, don't spray unless you've got baby bugs out there that are going to continue to eat leaves. Then you might have to spray. So you got to count insects. You got to know what those insects and diseases are doing.
Are the GPS systems that they use sophisticated enough to evaluate the pest
No,
effect?
not yet. Although you can do defoliation, but I don't think they're good enough yet to know what insects are there and how many are there, particularly in the egg stages and the juvenile stages, which that takes going out into the field and flipping over leaves and looking for little tiny things when it's hot and humid. It's uncomfortable work. So cultural control, yes, rotate crops, but we have a lot of farmers in Michigan that go continuous corn on the same field year after year. It's corn, 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 corn. The best it gets is corn, soybean, corn, soybean, corn, soybean. So if you rotate crops, you can break disease and insect cycles. But if you only got one or two crops, there's not much capacity to rotate, is there? So we can use genetic resistance, but all of our corn hybrids are based on 3 inbred lines. And so there isn't much resistance out there to an awful lot of the insects and diseases that might be a problem. We can do strip cropping, and you might see some of this in like the southwestern Wisconsin, especially where you've got really hilly land. And you do strip cropping where you plant your rows perpendicular to the slope to slow down soil erosion. But a lot of farmers really don't like to do strip cropping, certainly not that extensive of strip cropping, because it's expensive and time consuming to figure out where you're going to plant everything. It's just way easier just to drive your planter across the field one whoosh and be done. Now, if you think about, I've got corn growing with soybeans, corn needs different pesticides, herbicides, and insecticides than soybean does. So not only is it a function of planting, you also got to think about the pesticides that you're going to use in the insect pests. And typically, some of these herbicides like Benvel it will volatilize. So if I spray Benvel on my corn to kill my broadleaf plants, it will float over to the soybeans and kill those. So if I'm going to do a strip crop, there's a whole bunch of pesticides I can't actually use because they'll actually damage the neighboring crop. So I can promote biological control, ladybugs, wasps, but we don't have much biodiversity out there. And there's only green things growing in a cornfield about 3 months out of the year. The rest of the year, nothing is growing there. There's some debris from the last crop decomposing, but that's it. I can use pheromone traps, and people will do that. You've probably seen little contraptions like that sort of thing. They are used actually more on the IPM side, the integrated pest management side, to try to understand how many insects are out there of a particular kind to know if I'm going to spray or not. Ideally, pheromone traps, you catch all the males of some kind of bug and they get trapped in there and they get killed. And it turns out they don't necessarily work quite as well as you might hope. And I already talked about the mechanical tillage thing and pesticides. Turns out if we do no-till, the evidence suggests we can really stop soil erosion dead in its tracks. So this is geologic rates of soil production in millimeters of soil produced per year. So 0.2 of 1 millimeter. So this is kind of winter, freezing and wedging, freezing, thawing. You create new soil every year at that rate. If we use no-till, that's the rate of soil erosion. Those two lines are pretty close to each other. You're probably not building soil in no-till, not necessarily, but at least you're not eroding it. As opposed to conventional tillage, you are losing 10 times. You're losing soil 10 times faster than it's made through natural geologic process. So yeah, I mean, if you can do no-till, it will protect soil. Minimum and no-till systems do reduce soil erosion, but they require specialized equipment. They create cold, wet seed beds, and it takes several years to produce yields comparable to conventional till. So people will ask, why don't all farmers do no-till? They got to be able to control their weeds. They got to buy expensive equipment. One planter, we're talking $200,000-$300,000. And farmers don't generally have $200,000-$300,000 laying around, and they probably can't get that kind of money from a bank. So precision ag does do certain things. It's not as good as visualizing insects, but precision ag does allow you to see kind of year by year over year, where does your crop yield less? Shade that red. Where does your crop yield more? Shade that green. You can put contour lines around slope, around weed problems, around soil types. These are soil type lines. And you can put more nutrients here where you've got high yield potential. You can put less nutrients there. So farmers can do variable rate planting, variable rate pesticide application. They can actually switch pesticides on the go. So they they'll usually hire a consultant who will program this. They go into their tractor cab, they plug in a thumb drive, and then turn on the tractor and go and let the GPS system tell them, the entire system, how many seeds to plant per acre as you're driving 7 miles per hour through the field, how much fertilizer to put down, which pesticide to use and how much or none. So precision ag is definitely a step in the right direction, especially if you're going to, be one farmer or one person who's going to cover 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 acres with some level of precision. So GIS, precision ag this is the GPS monitor up here. This is telling the computer where the combine is in the field, and you can literally on the go measure what the yield is each meter of the combine width as you're moving through the field and record it. So this is the yield map getting made as the farmer is combining. So sustainable ag has definitely improved sustainability, but I'm going to argue that agriculture remains inherently unsustainable. It's definitely moving in the right direction, but I'm unsatisfied, and here's why. Because we've selected high yielding crop varieties, grain yield capacity has increased, but we've got very little genetic diversity there. So I read that as risk. So if you get one disease that your genetics can't compensate for or protect against, and you don't have a pesticide, A, it's going to prejudice towards the use of pesticides, and B, there's really risk in case you don't have a pesticide. So I said, yes, less soil erosion. So we are losing 1.2 to 2 bushels of soil per bushel of corn produced per year. That's a 50% improvement over what we used to have. But we're still losing soil at an unsustainable rate. So yeah, I love sustainable ag, but it's not enough. We got to push this a whole lot further. Greater nitrogen use. So we used to have nitrogen use efficiency of 20 to 25%. That means if I apply 100 pounds of nitrogen, the corn plants that I'm applying it for get 20 to 25%, which means 75 to 80% of that nitrogen I applied is going into other places. It's either going into the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, or it's going into the local pond where it's going to cause an algal bloom. Lake Erie is kind of the notable big pond example around here. So to protect fresh water and wells, we've got to, and reduce global climate change, our nitrogen use efficiency needs to be around 0. But I would say, you know, a few years back, 20 years ago, nitrogen use efficiency, well, was 20%. Now it's 40%. So we've doubled the improvement, but we're not where we need to be. Adaption of integrated pest management. So this is like counting the bugs and then just using that to determine when to spray or not. Currently, we use 50% less active ingredient. We use a lot less pesticide than we used to in our agricultural fields, but still probably way too much. What was your question originally? You had a question. Oh, nitrogen. The question was nitrogen from legumes, green manures versus nitrogen fertilizer. Yes, to that question, you might recall last week I showed you the kind of the white tank. We put ammonia into production fields. That's how plants get the nitrogen. We typically have to apply that ammonia-based nitrogen 2 weeks before we plant our seeds. And so our seeds don't need any nitrogen. In fact, our seedlings don't need very much nitrogen because it's a small plant. So those plants, a cornfield doesn't really need a lot of nitrogen until we get into like middle of July to August, when you've got a big plant. And a big plant's going to need more energy, just like a big kid. You're going to have to feed a big kid more food than a baby. Same thing. When you apply all your nitrogen in March and early April, there's about a month and a half to 2 months where that nitrogen's got to sit in the field waiting for the corn plants to get big. And so during that waiting time is when a lot of that nitrogen use efficiency is lost. Now, that's nitrogen from fertilizer. Nitrogen from a legume or a green manure is a bit different, because what happens is our bean plants or our alfalfa plants that we maybe tilled into the ground in the previous fall or the previous spring, all of that nitrogen is tied up in that plant, in the plant's proteins, in the structure of the plant itself. And so it's not until microbes really completely digest, consume, decompose those plants that you till under as compost, it's not until they are done consuming that those nitrogen atoms become available to the corn plant. So if you start digging around in a cornfield, you can find corn stalks, bean stalks from the previous crop hanging around in the soil where you buried them, let's say, or on the soil surface until about June, July, August. So the bulk of the nitrogen from green manures or compost is becoming available to the plant in June, and especially July and August, when the plant needs the most of it. So that's where you can gain the efficiency. That get to your question?
But then if you know, if you think about growing a cover crop,
Mhm.
that takes away time that you could have corn or production. How does that economically affect things?
Yeah, so a farmer really will not probably hardly ever, if ever, plant a cover crop when they're growing their crop of cash interest. Cover crops, if I'm in my garden as well, I plant my cover crops usually in August. I'll overseed a lot of the crop area in my garden with hairy vetch, which is a legume. It's not a very aggressive legume. And so, but it is also a cold tolerant plant. So my hairy vetch seeds are going to germinate in September, and they're going to grow as little seedlings in September, October, November on the warm days. And then they kind of freeze because it is Michigan. And then there'll be periods of thawing as you get into like February and March. Those plants will actually stay alive underneath the snow, and they'll just resume growth in March and April. And then I'll go in with a light till and kill them with my rototiller. So we're growing the cover crops at times when your crop plants are not growing, as a way of extending the growing season in a way. So remember that corn and soybean in particular, they are semi-tropical plants. They need warmth. They do not have the cold tolerance that a cover crop, the kinds of cover crops that we would use here would have.
So if you think about it, what about corn stalks
Yeah.
and the plant of the soybean?
Mhm.
Do they help in terms of if you left some of that?
Yes,
Does that help some of the
it does.
soil?
It does. If you leave the corn stalks on the top of the soil surface, even in no-till, earthworms and springtails, little insects and annelids, they eat that corn, they eat that old crop debris kind of all year round, as long as it's warm enough for them to be alive and be active. So they're actively decomposing the corn stalks and the corn leaves left behind from the previous crop. Same is true with soybean, except that with soybean, you're talking about a more nitrogen-rich kind of plant debris. So there's some crops, corn will give you a fair bit of carbon in organic matter, but not much nitrogen. So the carbon-nitrogen ratio favors carbon. Soybean, if you talk about a legume, will leave you organic matter with a carbon-nitrogen ratio that has relatively more nitrogen in it, which for the next crop that you grow, you probably actually want, which is why I use hairy vetch to get a high carbon nitrogen ratio as not grass clippings, and certainly not like oak leaves or pine needles, which would really acidify your soil.
Just as an aside here, where does, the reason I'm going to ask this question is because a few years ago, I used to know that over by Allendale, they used manure a lot.
Mhm.
That has diminished over time. How does manure fit into this equation, or does it at all?
Oh, absolutely it does. Manure is really organic matter. It's a cow is going to eat silage and corn and whatever, and it's what it poops out, right? So the corn is going to strip out, the cow is going to strip out a lot of the protein that's in the stuff that they eat, and they're going to poop out what's left, a lot of cellulose. Well, cellulose is just the stuff of like corn stalks, if you will. But manure inherently is fairly nitrogen rich because it's also loaded with salmonella and E. coli, the bacteria that were in the rumen of the cow, actually doing a lot of the digestion for the cow. And so, farmers, if they've got livestock, they will certainly recycle that manure out into the agricultural field as a biomass, actually a very nitrogen rich biomass. So why don't all farmers do that? Why are they doing it less? They don't have any animals. They have become specialized. They either grow corn and soybean or they grow animals. Now, farmers are pretty inventive. If their neighbors got animals Or if I've got animals and I've got a big pile of manure and no place to put it, I will sell it to the local farmer as a fertilizer. So if there are animals around, that manure will be recycled into the soils for sure. And will offset some of the need for chemical fertilizer. Cool. Okay, we want to go through this fairly fast, this next little set, because I want to get to agroecology. So what I want to point out here is ecological impacts of meat production, specifically on greenhouse gases. And so greenhouse gases are not all made the same. Carbon dioxide will hang around in the atmosphere for 50 to 200 years. It's got a global greenhouse warming potential of what's called 1. So it's the baseline. Methane is got an atmospheric lifetime of 12 years. So it doesn't hang around really that long, but it's got a warming potential of 21. So 21 times that molecule for molecule of carbon dioxide. Of course, when methane breaks down, it breaks down to carbon dioxide. So in the atmosphere. So it's kind of like, even though the methane breaks down, the problem's not gone. You've just now got it as carbon dioxide until the carbon dioxide breaks down. Nitrous oxide, N2O, nitrogen, think nitrogen fertilizer, think urine, urea will convert to nitrous oxide in soil by bacteria, 114 years in the air, and a greenhouse warming effect of 289 molecule for molecule with CO2. So that's a backdrop. The warming effect is important. How much greenhouse gas comes from agriculture? If I were to ask you before this talk, where do you think most greenhouse gases come from? Cars. No, turns out not. Actually, more of it comes from energy production, actually producing more oil and gas. That's kind of the big solo driver. But where is the agricultural footprint in this chart? It's here. 18% of it is from livestock. But you've also got to produce grains and forages to feed those livestock. So that's 18 plus 12, that's 30 right there. And there's probably a little bit from land use, and there's probably a little bit from transportation, moving around fertilizer, manure, kind of everything. So it turns out, yeah, there's a lot of greenhouse gas coming from ag, from livestock specifically, is probably responsible for 30% or more. Where specifically are the greenhouse gases? CO2 is coming from on-farm fossil fuel use. So if I ask my students, where does agriculture produce greenhouse gases? They say we put fuel in tractors and then we drive the tractors around. Sure, that's like 1%. The greenhouse footprint on tractors is negligible compared to the other sources. Methane from ruminants, 25%. That's where that's a quarter of it. Another is carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane are coming from manure. So yeah, we use our manure, but it is a prime source of greenhouse gas. And if you ever walk around manure, you can smell it because that's the methane. It's exactly what you're smelling. Deforestation, desertification actually is a pretty big contributor of CO2, 35%. These are global numbers. So that's where these are coming from. Direct sources there are direct and indirect sources from livestock. So from livestock, we can talk about direct sources. Here is the yellow bar is beef, or the green bar is beef. We're talking about kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of edible meat. So if we're talking about enteric methane emissions from ruminant animals, cows, that's where it is. That's a big number, 7.5, as opposed to manure from or nitrate N2O from manure. 1.75 is a pretty big number. Manure coming from, or methane coming from manure is smaller yet, 0.5. But if you look at that chart, think about the ruminants. What are the ruminants that we eat? Livestock. When we talk about livestock ruminants, what are we talking about here? Cows. Anything else? Sheep. Cows, sheep, and goats. Not pigs, not chickens. So from a dietary perspective, the food print of your meat choices, if you eat lamb, beef, or cheese, you've got a huge CO2 footprint. If you eat monogastrics, you have a pretty good sized footprint. But if you eat plants, there is a footprint, but it's really small. Just by food choices alone, by meat choices alone, you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 13 to 14 times. So cows, they have this ruminant system. Where does the methane come from in a cow? Most of it. It is digestive. Is it coming out? Our alimentary tract, food goes in here. Right. It goes to the bottom. Where is most of the methane coming from in the ruminant? It's here. Coming out of the mouth. They burp it out. Oh, yeah, sorry. I thought you were telling me where the methane was coming from. Yeah, the cows burp it out. So they chew their cud, they eat, they chew their cud. So they have compartments in their stomach. Typically, it's not at all appealing to think about, but it works for them. There are indirect livestock greenhouse gas sources. There's feed production, fertilizer, deforestation, and soil carbon. And each of them are significant, but I'll note that most of the corn and the soybean that we produce, over about half of it in the case of corn and over half in the case of soybean, well, when we talk about producing corn and beans, most of that's to feed animals. And so the greenhouse footprint to produce the feeds to feed the animals is also on the animal. And so when we talk about nitrous oxide from feed production, that's 61% of it. Well, where does that 61% coming from? 25% from manure and about another 23% from fertilizer and crop residue. So when you put this stuff in the ground, a lot of it doesn't stay there. Remember, we talked about the nitrogen use efficiency. Corn plants only with the best practices get 40%. That 60% bacteria are actually eating this ammonium ion that's in the soil. The bacteria are getting some energy out of it, and they're releasing N2O as a gas out into the atmosphere. That's kind of what's going on. So soil manure is a big chunk of it. Fertilizer is another chunk of it. And then manure management is kind of the third big chunk of it. So nitrogen from fertilizer production, when you get into alchemy of air, you realize, what does it take actually to make nitrogen fertilizer? So I kind of referenced this a couple of times. We're taking nitrogen gas, just two nitrogen atoms bound by a triple bond. 82% of the air we breathe is nitrogen gas. We breathe it in and we breathe it out. It's inert. The only time nitrogen gas bothers us as humans is if you're a deep sea diver and you come up too fast. It'll form bubbles in your blood, I think, and can kill a person if you don't go through the decompression chamber. So it turns out it takes a lot of energy to make ammonia fertilizer out of nitrogen gas. The conditions specifically in the process, 500 degrees Celsius and 200 atmospheres of pressure in a reactor with a catalyst. So how much fossil fuel do you have to burn to create and maintain 500 degrees Celsius? That's hot. That ain't degrees Fahrenheit. That's degrees Celsius, which is a lot hotter than Fahrenheit, and 200 atmospheres of pressure as well. You're gonna burn a lot of nitrogen gas. You're gonna burn a lot of natural gas and a lot of or coal potentially. I mean, the Germans had access to coal. That's what they burned. That's how they made the war machine work. So it turns out if you take ammonia, ammonium ion, NH4+, and you combine it with nitrate, NO3-, you have a very powerful fertilizer called ammonium nitrate. And that's what farmers used to use until Timothy McVeigh. Does that name ring a bell? Timothy McVeigh was a farmer in Michigan, and he packed a van full of ammonia nitrate, which he had access to because he was a farmer. And then he drove it down to Oklahoma City, and he blew up. I don't know what it was, but I think it killed a couple hundred people. So now farmers can't really buy ammonium nitrate anymore. And so really what farmers get as nitrogen fertilizer, they get it really almost all of it as ammonia, just straight up ammonia. Then there's deforestation, which is burning the trees is one thing, but not having the trees or not having our cornfields be green all of the time of the year that they could be green is nitrogen fixation potential. I mean, carbon dioxide fixation potential lost. So don't forget, you got not only the burning, more importantly is the land use change where we don't have green things growing in fields when certain fields could be growing green things. And then soil tillage. So Iowa used to have somewhere between 6 to 8% organic matter in their soils when the tall grass prairies were there. When they started tilling, every time you oxygenate those soils, there's a flush of nitrogen that comes out that is representing the decomposition of organic matter. Farmers kind of like to do that because it releases some nutrients that their crops can get, but they're not building or they're not maintaining their nitrogen, organic carbon stores the rate that they're consuming them. So if I go look at soil tests from most farmers in Iowa now, there would read organic matter content of 2% or less, which means roughly 2/3 of the organic matter carbon stored in those soils historically is now in the atmosphere as CO2.
And blows all over the, the dust storms, in other words.
It does.
It's often been blamed on tilling.
Yeah, definitely. Whenever you pull those implements through soil, we'd have to do a whole nother talk about how aggregates are made naturally in soils, kind of little soil particles kind of stuck together naturally. Whenever you till, you break those. And whenever you've got loose, small particles of soil sitting on the surface, if you get wind or rain, you're going to get erosion. So the wind erosion of the West, Kansas, the dust storms were driving that. I mean, the tillage was driving the dust storms along with the wind. Yeah. So we want to get into agroecology in the time that we've got left as a possible alternative. So here's where I'm going to get a little snarky on you and say, okay, I really like sustainable ag, but it's not enough. And so I'm going to say, if you have a hemorrhage, a Band-Aid won't do. And I think maybe even our physician here would acknowledge you need more than a Band-Aid. System problems require system solutions. I don't think the system problem is the farmer. The farmer understands this all too well, kind of everything that I've talked about. They, I think, in my opinion, are components in a larger system. Their input costs are determined for them. Their output values are determined externally from them. They are trying to make a profit, stay economically alive within a system. Not too many farmers are getting too wealthy. So could an extensified system address these environmental and human health concerns? So an extensified system would be an agroecology or agroecological system. So agroecology, I'll give you the definition, then I'm going to make you think about it a second or a minute. It's the application of ecological concepts and principles of an inherently sustainable ecosystem to the design and management of agroecosystems. This is why that story about me realizing, and maybe hopefully you and farmers and our people at Michigan State and Iowa State realizing that production fields are ecosystems is really important. So think of give me a name of of an inherently sustainable ecosystem? Where do you like to go on vacation? Yeah.
The example that's being used frequently now is fish ponds, particularly in Southeast Asia.
Southeast Asia, or but even better yet, the natural fish pond. Think of a forest. If you go Michigan, northern Michigan, and you go through those forests, other than maybe being messed with logging for a while, those forests have been forests for a really long time, and they will continue being forests. You can think about the woodlots here. I mean, even around Southwest Michigan, those woodlots, do they require any fertilizer? Do you have to irrigate them? If it rains really hard, have you ever seen water run out of a forest? Think of a tall grass prairie, Iowa. So I don't know if anybody here is from Iowa, but you know what tall grass prairies are. If you have a tall grass prairie and it's sitting there, do you have to do anything to keep it a tall grass prairie for hundreds of even thousands of years? You don't have to water them. You don't have to fertilize them. If they burn, they'll grow back. These are inherently sustainable ecosystems. So what is it about a northern hardwood forest that keeps it a northern hardwood forest? And can we design agro systems to be sustainable like that? Or what is it about natural ecosystems that we can apply to agro ecosystems? So here's your northern hardwood forest. You don't see animals in there, but I can assure you they're there. If you're rabbits and squirrels and birds and everything else. Here's tall grass prairie. I'll note buffalo, a livestock type of animal, is a resident and an essential part of that ecosystem. But maybe not a buffalo on every piece of land all the time. They migrate around. So ecological features or principles, what makes them sustainable for potentially millennia, resistant to disturbance, or if a disturbance happens, they bounce back to the ecosystem that they were originally. That's the key. So biodiversity. We back that up, and I don't tell you, you look at that. What do you see here that's different than a cornfield or a soybean field or a wheat field? There's a lot of stuff. So we call that biodiversity. And when we talk about biodiversity, we're not talking about just different kinds of plants. We're talking about different kinds of plants and animals that all live within a system context. So when I teach field biology of spring, I start with geology, soils. Then we go to plants, plant communities. Certain plants live with other plants. Certain animals live within northern forests. Different kinds of animals live in aquatic systems. So there are definitely meaningful associations of organisms living together in various places. Now think about your gardens. Are you not doing some of the same sorts of things in your vegetable gardens? Although they might be smaller. So biodiversity turns out to be really important. Plant, animal, and microorganism. Nutrient recycling. Kind of made the point. A northern hardwood forest stays a northern hardwood forest. You don't have to fertilize it with nitrogen every year to get things to grow and actually potentially grow pretty fast. Occasional tillage where the animals are doing the tillage. The hooves of the livestock, the hooves of the buffalo, they go and they stir the soil up. Water capture. Have you ever seen water run out of a forest? Have you ever seen water run off a lawn? Have you ever seen water run out of an agricultural field? So there's very big differences in soils and how soils are functioning. So there are two food production paradigms. And this is the system change. To ensure a sustainable production of adequate food for the human population, there are two approaches being debated within kind of the agricultural circles, if you will, mainly. And that is intensify the current system or extensify. Think about a somewhat different system. And most of the cards are in this intensify bucket. So they're winning the game of war right now. Adapt and improvise a more sustainable techniques using intensive monoculture systems. And so it's to do more sustainable ag of what I was talking about. We've improved nitrogen use from 20% to 40%. Let's try to get it to 50, 60, 70%, for example. The other option is to extensify, adapt a more regenerative agriculture or an agroecology. These would be systems that would look very different to economically produce healthful food and restore environmental health. So this is what an intensified system would look like, maybe with more GIS, more precision ag, as opposed to an extensified system. That's my vegetable garden of about mid-July a year ago. It's a very different kind looking system, isn't it? What are we producing here? We're producing cows, and we're producing ethanol. We're producing ultra-processed foods. What are we producing here? I think something a little bit closer to the DASH dietary pattern. Fruits, vegetables, potentially, although there are many fruits there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a question. One of the differences I see in these normal ecosystems and the agricultural ecosystem that you're proposing is that normal natural ecosystems are more closed systems in a way.
They are.
And the agricultural system would be by definition an open one because we're
Yeah.
taking all
Right.
the nutrients out.
And they're leaky.
Yeah.
They're only, open
Both
because we're
things.
taking, but they're leaky. So you have to put lots of inputs in.
Yeah.
And we take some outputs out and the other outputs leak out.
Okay, so that's also the problem. I mean, how do you input those things without having
Mhm.
them leak out and do bad things outside
Yeah.
when they go out as leakage and not as output, as production output? So
Yeah. So that's a nice way of thinking about it. In this extensified system, I am trying to reduce the inputs as much as I can, partly because I got to buy them. If I buy fertilizer, and I don't want to have to buy fertilizer if I don't have to. I don't want to apply pesticides. I don't want to consume the pesticides. I think I could apply them in a way that wouldn't make me sick, but at the same time, I don't want to take any chances either. So I'd rather grow my vegetable garden without any pesticides. It turns in the same thing is true with nitrogen. I'd rather not apply any nitrogen, and I don't have to anymore because when I started gardening 20 years ago, I did because I only had like 1% organic matter. But now I got like 8% organic matter because I've been building compost over a long period of time. Now I don't need to apply any fertilizer anymore. So this is really functioning as a much more closed system than that is. So you're right. You want to close these systems as much as we can. And I want to bring up the idea of the term efficiency. So think about efficiency kind of going forward. So there are trade-offs, trade-offs, systems are in place for industrialized ag. They produce a lot of food that fill our grocery stores. Food is pretty inexpensive. I mean, we gripe about it a lot, but in terms of how much disposable income we spend on food, it's not very much. Industrialized agriculture is efficient. I've heard that a lot, and that word troubled me a lot. That's why it's underlined. And I think it is in a very narrow way of thinking. On the other hand, extensify because we can produce essentially more fruits and vegetables, probably less expensively. It's ecologically regenerative, but can it produce enough food to feed a growing global population? That hung me up for a really long time, like 10 years. And then, and it tends to be more expensive because of labor. And it was because of this guy, Norman Borlaug, the author of The Green Revolution. And he threw organic ag under the bus. And he said, don't ever pursue it because you're feeding the wealthy. There are going to be millions of people that are not going to be able to have enough food to eat. if we pursue that. And so I'm gonna skip this. I'm gonna jump up. We can go back on this next week if you like. Turns out, when you look at the literature, polycultures outyield monocultures. Even intensively managed monocultures with the most fertilizer and the best precision ag possible. 2001, looking at a 16 species polyculture, the polyculture yielded 238 times the average of the other 16 grown as monocultures. That's 2.4 times more food per unit of land area. Mangan in 2011 found polyculture yielded 28% more than the highest yielding monoculture. Picasso 2008 looked at 2 to 6 species, different combinations. The polyculture yielded 73% more, almost double the highest yielding monoculture. Another guy, 2010, plus 54%, plus 70%, plus 35 to 50%. More recently, looking at it again, 2024, plus 11 to 13%, plus 16, plus 31, plus 95. So each one of these studies were, somewhat differently. Corn and soybeans, even growing just corn and soybeans in polyculture, the Three Sisters turns out actually does work if you look at calories produced per unit land area. A C3, C4 plants, different ways of looking at it. So this is another way of thinking about efficiency. When we think about food production efficiency of our industrialized ag system, we are talking specifically about labor use efficiency, calories produced per person. When you've got one farmer managing 3,000 acres, when you've got less than 1% of Americans producing all the calories that we eat, that is very labor use efficient. Of course, they're using combines and big planters and that sort of thing, equipment, fertilizers as surrogates for human labor. But when we talk about efficiency, that's actually what we mean. If we talk about light use efficiency, cornfields are not very light use efficient. A forest understory turns green in March. We don't, in the leaves on trees come out in April and May. We don't plant the cornfield until May. And it grows in, even if you go out cornfields today, there are big rows or a lot of ground exposed between rows. Most fields yet, even though we're almost July, knee high by the 4th of July, it's not until the leaves of the corn plant cover every bit of soil surface that we are 100%, with actually 3 layers of leaves, are we light use efficient. So we lose tons of solar radiation. That solar radiation hits the soil surface. It's not captured by plants. It's not generating food. So as opposed to the forest understory, which is covered green by March. And how many of you plant early season vegetables already in March and April and May? And I'm eating out of my garden already in April without even the use of a hoop house. And so there is in cornfields just lots of light that is not efficiently used. Nitrogen use efficiency. My vegetable garden, I don't know, I don't need to apply any nitrogen fertilizer because I've got organic levels up. In forests, you don't need to apply any fertilizer and they're highly productive, but corn, obviously, you need to. And so there's a nitrogen use efficiency difference. So each one of these categories, you can talk about soil, so think soil erosion in forests versus cornfields, carbon use, think organic matter. When we talk about food production in the United States being efficient, we're talking about calories produced per hour labor, which turns out to be a problem. So conclusions, diets rich in fruits, vegetables, grains, nuts, and some white meat protect from chronic disease and may restore human health. That was week 1. Polycultures integrating fruits, vegetables, grains, nuts, chickens, pigs, cows consistently produce 35 to 50% more food per unit area. We don't have to worry about feeding a growing global population because the best way to increase food production capacity globally would be to adopt polycultures, not persist in industrialized monocultures. And current market systems and cultural inertia certainly maintain the current industrialized monoculture food system. Question is, how do we think about alternatives to that inertia? And that's the topic next week. Kind of blasted you in the last 10 minutes. Sorry, I went 5 over 2. Yes.
Important question. Thank you. One of the most important questions in any system is how is information dispersed throughout the system in that? And I think consistent problems has been information has been essentially stopped at the top in many cases in that. And then there's been economic dams that prevent the circulation of information. What do you see as a more efficient way to spread information about this kind of thing throughout our communities?
I think the most efficient way is going to have to be person to person, and it's going to have to probably center around the function of CSAs, community supported agriculture, farmers markets, that kind of venue, because I like the kind of the image of a economic dam. Think about where the money in food production systems is centered right now. It's corn and soybean. And why is it centered there? Largely it's Farm Bill. And so who's controlling the messaging? It's not the government. It's the Dairy Farmers Association, the Corn Growers Association, the Beef Growers Association, the Pork Producers Associations. They've got advocates in DC. They've got all kinds of billboards of, drink milk, the little white mustache. That's where the messaging is coming from. Right now, if you look at vegetable growers, there are no carrot growers associations or lettuce growers associations. Maybe we work at grass levels to start some of those kinds of organizations to get some of that messaging out. I think our healthcare industry, to the degree that we can get physicians maybe more trained in nutrition, I mean, this is going to be a little bit my argument next week. If you really want to protect your health, this is the kind of dietary pattern to consume. Oh yeah, by the way, how is it easiest to most economically produce that pattern? Polyculturally. And so let people's desire to have more control over their own health and healthcare costs drive the agricultural change. So I'm definitely going after a consumer up approach, and you'll get a full load of that next week.
Polyculture. What
Labor.
are the people? It's all labor.
What's the downside of polycultures? You cannot use big machines like a combine to plant a polycultural field and then harvest it. So it's going to take more human labor. Definitely. That is not more money. No. At the beginning, yes. Well, it depends on how you measure your expense. That's next week. So we're going to talk about externalized costs. If we start attributing healthcare costs to the actual cost of consuming a standard American diet, you're going to start thinking about your food costs differently. I'm going to ask you next week, start thinking about it now. What does a pound of hamburger really cost? I haven't bought a pound of hamburger at the store in a long time. What does it cost? Anybody know? $8 for a pound of hamburger? Okay, so is a pound of hamburger really cost you $8? I'm going to say it costs you way more than $8. Way, way, way more than $8. If you consider your healthcare costs as being driven by the hamburger. And so we can help people understand that. I think you maybe start changing people's attitudes a bit. And realize people actually have the power to make those changes, which are actually happening. They're already happening. The revolution is underway. Farmers markets are in lots of places where they never used to be.
Let's give a round of applause to David Dornbos for presentation today. And session 4 will be a week from today at 1 o'clock. And I can't remember exactly what he's going to be talking about, but it'll be just as good as today, I'm sure. So thank you, David.
Thank you.